China develops a coronavirus cure, while the U.S. government targets Chinese state-run media, and how China uses honey traps for espionage in America. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This episode is sponsored by Surfshark, because you should be using a reliable VPN whenever you go online. The deadly coronavirus has been spreading throughout China, but never fear. Chinese leader and honey lover Xi Jinping has vowed to win the people's war against the coronavirus. It should be no problem for him. After all, he was the first one on the problem, even before, apparently, himself. You see, when Xi Jinping first publicly talked about the coronavirus on January 20th, it was already pretty late in the game. He blamed local officials for covering it up. Blamed the local officials, not the central government. Except it turns out that Xi Jinping knew about the coronavirus at least 2 weeks before that official announcement. The official Communist Party magazine Qiushi published this speech Xi Jinping gave, where he said that back on January 7th, he told China's top leadership to prevent and control the coronavirus. January 7th was 13 days before his first public speech about the coronavirus. That potentially implicates Xi Jinping in the bungled early response to the outbreak that contributed to its rapid spread. So it's weird that state-run Qiushi would publish this speech, while other state-run media have been portraying Xi Jinping as all-knowing and on top of the problem. That certainly has some China watchers puzzled. To me, it seems likely it's the factional infighting within the Communist Party coming to the surface again. Many officials inside the party want to see Xi Jinping purged. After all, Xi has purged more than 2.7 million officials in his anti-corruption campaign. So pushing the blame for the coronavirus cover-up into Xi's lap would be a pretty good way to hurt him politically. I wonder what will happen next. Next time on General Hostility. Was Xi Jinping hiding a dirty secret? Is his mortal enemy trying to expose him? Is it all just a power grab by a secret lover? There is some good news. Communist authorities have discovered an easy new treatment for the coronavirus. Slapping people. Yes, meet the 3 newest members of China's Politburo Standing Committee. Okay, the reason that they're slapping and grabbing and wrestling people to the ground is that these people were not wearing masks. I mean, they probably don't actually have the coronavirus since the police were willing to slap them. Of course, slapping people when they disobey you does have a downside. I know, who would have thought? The way they've gone about it is quite dangerous because you actually start to erode that trust in the government. You want citizens coming forward and saying, "I feel unwell." I can't imagine why people wouldn't trust the Chinese government. And coming up after the break, how the FBI combats Chinese spies and honey traps. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Ever hear of a honey trap? A honey trap is when a hostile foreign government uses, say, a beautiful woman to seduce someone. A politician, a businessman, a scientist. They might give her information that could pose a national security threat. Or she could just use the salacious encounter to blackmail him. And let's just say, Chinese leaders know a thing or two about honey. I sat down with former FBI operative Mark Ruskin, author of The Pretender, My Life Undercover for the FBI, to find out how Chinese agents are using honey traps and many other techniques to infiltrate the United States. Thanks for joining me today, Mark.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Chris. Thank you for inviting me.
Sure. Well, so as a former FBI agent, what have you seen are some of the ways the Chinese Communist Party is trying to gain influence in the United States?
Well, the Chinese intelligence services, along with other hostile intelligence services, exploit a number of vulnerabilities that exist in the United States. And to a large extent, and this may be surprising to some of your viewers, but the majority of the data that they seek is actually available through open sources. Much of it is available legally to anyone who takes the trouble to look for it.
Is this what you mean by vulnerabilities?
Yeah, by vulnerabilities, I'm talking about open manners in which data which can be of use to a hostile power such as China can be accessed without necessarily violating any federal or American laws. A lot of the data that is significant and can be used for hostile adversary purposes is actually available through open sources. Much of it is information, for example, such as technical reports, research, engineering, which has been conducted on a very sophisticated level and has not yet been classified. So there's often a lag time, for example, with advanced research, the publication of the research not being reviewed and being ultimately classified as secret or top secret. But since the Chinese intelligence services are very active and on the ball and alert, often they've already accessed the information and it's at the door prior to it being classified.
Well, so what might China do with this information?
Well, we're talking, I'm thinking basically information of a technical level which can then be used by their own engineers and their own researchers to advance their own level of sophistication, bypassing the research that they would have had to do themselves in order to reach the same point. In other words, they're taking advantage, and this is a problem with academia in the United States, in that we have a very open society, and by having this kind of openness, it gives more access to hostile services to obtain information, either through a variety of methods, but often not necessarily through espionage, but often it's simply by being alert and being quick and accessing and knowing where to look and when to look.
So that's kind of similar to how recently it came out that the chair of Harvard's chemistry department was getting funding from China.
Right. Just last month, just at the end of January, there was an arrest of Professor Lieber and announcements by the special agent in charge of the FBI in Boston, Bonaventura, who he explained in his statements that right now China is, in his view, and presumably reflects the view of the FBI today, China is the largest intelligence threat to the U.S. Whether it's larger than Russia or not, it's kind of like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin type of question. Mm-hmm. In either case, they're all hostile intelligence services, and we need to take preventative counterintelligence type measures in order to protect ourselves from hostile acts.
Well, so you've talked about how China takes advantage of open source information, how in the case of the Harvard professor Lieber, how money can buy off people. How does China use foreign agents in the United States?
Well, historically, there have been a number of ways that the Chinese have used traditional espionage techniques. One in particular that's been very successful is, and it may seem reminiscent of John le Carré novels, but the reality is what's referred to in tradecraft as a honey trap, which is using an attractive female case officer, an intelligence officer, to develop a relationship with someone who has access to classified information, and it's a long-term proposition to develop an intimate, ultimately physical relationship, or maybe even a relationship that the target believes is a legitimate emotional relationship. There was an FBI agent, a supervisor, James, and his last name escapes me right now, but who, with Cassandra Leung, was the name of the intelligence officer, not her real Mandarin name. But she developed a relationship with him, and for 20 years, that relationship continued. It's hard to imagine, for nearly 2 decades, and he was the supervisor of a China counterintelligence squad in the FBI's Los Angeles office. And he was taking, apparently, from what I understand, confidential classified documents to his rendezvous with her. So until ultimately he was arrested after he retired and entered into a plea agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office.
How common are these honey traps?
Unfortunately, it's a question that has no real answer, because all we know about is the ones that were caught, right? So from time to time, in the FBI, it's not very common that we know about. The first one in the history of the FBI involved an agent called Richard Miller, who was seduced by a Soviet, at that time Soviet Union agent, whose name was Svetlana Agolonvenka. And so how often does it happen in other agencies? I would suspect it happens more often in other agencies. The FBI has a pretty serious vetting process for recruiting agents, and as the CIA does as well. But there are other areas where these honey traps could be used, and which are not to infiltrate America's counterintelligence services, but simply to infiltrate, say, academia. You could have this kind of technique being utilized with college professors or engineers working at nuclear research laboratories, which we wouldn't know about because they haven't come to surface yet.
So besides these methods, what other tactics is the Chinese Communist Party using in the United States?
I guess the one answer would be whatever they can imagine and come up with. As we all know, the Russians, the Soviets, were, since the creation of the Soviet Union, has been attempting to influence the American elections. With regard to the Russians, we can read about it because since the fall of the Soviet Union, many ex-KGB officers who worked in the US have been able to publish their memoirs. So you can go to the bookstore and buy Kalugin's book and see how they were in New York and in Washington doing their best through all types of clandestine activity to influence the elections. Now, presumably if the Russians were doing it, the Chinese were doing it also. However, we don't have a bunch of ex-Chinese intelligence officers publishing their memoirs, because I would imagine that their longevity would be very dim indeed were they to attempt to do so, as would the health of their family members, right, probably. So we don't know firsthand. But what we do know is what has been uncovered just through ordinary criminal investigations, and for that we can just look back to the Clinton re-election campaign. In the Clinton re-election campaign, there was Johnny Young, and the thousands and thousands of dollars that were being apparently, allegedly contributed both directly to the Clinton re-election campaign and to the Democratic National Committee.
This is Bill Clinton and the Chinagate scandal in the 90s?
Right, and yeah, of course it didn't become as much of a scandal, I would suggest, as it should have been, because according to reporting in the media, there was direct links between the People's Republic of China military intelligence services and the recipients or the middlemen for that money going to the campaign. So you asked what other techniques. I would suggest that contributing to a political party and contributing to a president's re-election campaign, and it's more than just mere suspicion. There was 22 convictions as a result of this.
So this is another tactic.
It's a tactic, and it's a tactic. How successful is it? I can't evaluate it, but it's certainly a tactic that arguably was used in order to influence the outcome of an American presidential election, and also arguably inference can be made that there's a certain amount of influence that's being purchased through that kind of donation.
So it seems like the Chinese Communist Party is taking advantage of the free and open society we have in the United States. How can the U.S. counter this without giving up these freedoms?
Well, there have been attempts. The FBI, for example, many years ago, had an initiative where librarians were recruited. Since there's so much access to open source information, the thought was that by bringing in librarians to identify suspect individual patrons, and it may sound a little simple, but it could have been very effective, individuals with accents from countries which are known to be hostile to the US, accessing highly technical reports on a continuing basis. It was thought, the idea was, and I think it was a good idea, that these could have provided leads in order to identify, whether they be Chinese or Russian or from other hostile powers, individuals seeking to exploit open source information. The reaction from the librarians and from the civil liberties groups was hardly very cooperative. It was just the opposite. There was a big negative reaction that caused the initiative to essentially have to be shut down. There was a lot of publicity about it at the time in the New York Times, but ultimately it didn't work. A similar attempt occurred after 9/11. When the Patriot Act was passed, there was a clause that was referred to as the Library Clause, in which, again, the FBI and other government agencies were seeking to obtain information regarding access by the Chinese and other hostile powers to open source but significant technological information. Again, the reaction was hardly cooperative. It seems almost absurd, but there were signs being put in the library to warn patrons that their access may be subject to government review. So rather than cooperate, it was just the opposite. The librarians were essentially warning off potential patrons who could be identified. So it's a tricky, it's a balancing act. We want
I was going to say, because I can kind of understand that, that fear, because in going after, China takes advantage of the open source information, but essentially the free and open access information in the United States. So if the government tries to stop that, it's almost like they're trying to stop free and open access to information, which is at the is one of the cores of our society.
Right, it's a core value, and I would argue that we want to maintain openness. We want to maintain our liberties. That's what makes this country almost unique among other countries, is our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the privacy rights which we enjoy, albeit some would argue, I would argue, that many of the Bill of Rights provisions are being chipped away now, unfortunately. But we do want to continue to enjoy them best we can. And so it's a balancing act. To what extent do we maintain openness and at the same time protect national security? And I think a lot has to involve ethical behavior by our counterintelligence services and our intelligence gathering services, and regulations, legislation which is designed or tailored to safeguard our country and at the same time safeguard our liberties.
So what are some of the ways the FBI is trying to counter Chinese espionage operations? Or is that too classified?
Well, I think the best way to address that is to just refer to the FBI's techniques in general to counter the intelligence activities of hostile countries. And I would suggest that they're not country-specific necessarily. So the techniques that the Bureau uses are to fight Soviet, that's not Soviet, but to fight Russian intelligence activities or Cuban intelligence activities or Chinese intelligence activities, essentially, in an unclassified sense, are pretty much the same techniques. Mm-hmm. They may be, depending on the techniques being used by the hostile power, they may be fine-tuning so that they are adapted to that particular country, but overall, it's not like it's a whole different bag of tricks for each different country. For example, I worked a number of cases, and they're discussed in some of the chapters in my book. As an undercover agent, I worked false flag operations. Now, false flag operations are directed against any number of hostile type of intelligence activities, and they're not country specific. So, and the way a false flag operation works essentially is, just to briefly summarize, because I don't think that this is popular, known to a large extent, is when an individual is identified who wants to sell or transfer classified information to another country's intelligence service. So it could be to China, to the Chinese intelligence, it could be to Russian intelligence.
Exactly.
But they're trying to sell, so the individual is identified, let's say he is a nuclear engineer at a facility that does research, that does classified research, or perhaps an army colonel who has access to classified military intelligence. Then he or she reaches out through some tech, perhaps let's say to a friend. Do you know anyone in X capital of X country who might be interested in buying this information? And the source then, instead of going to someone in that country, comes to the FBI and says, hey, do you know that Professor so-and-so or Colonel so-and-so or engineer so-and-so is seeking to sell secrets to wherever. Mm-hmm. And then the espionage unit at FBI headquarters would then reach out to me and say, Mark, we need to, you to reach out to this individual. And we very quickly set up an operation where I would pretend to be an intelligence officer working on behalf of that country. Now, depending on the country, I could say that I'm either from that country, or if it's obvious that I'm not from that country.
Like China.
Yeah, right. But I could be working for the intelligence service of another country on behalf, as a proxy, on behalf of China or wherever. And then say, well, it's a hostile operating environment here, so they can't send somebody out, but they've asked my country to send out someone in their stead, and you're so important, and stroking the individual, you're so important that they've sent me, a very high-level intelligence officer in my country, to make contact with you and establish a relationship. And these cases were very sensitive because, and they needed someone who, and by this point I had a lot of experience doing this kind of work, because the first contact was critical. If the individual, the future trader, didn't believe that I was who I was claiming to be, that would be the end. It would be shut down. There'd be no second chance, no second bite at the apple. So these were, but once they bit, then we would develop a whole clandestine system for them to transfer information to me. Mm-hmm. Something straight out of a John le Carré or Tom Clancy type thing, with dead drops and whatever, to make them feel they were really working in a clandestine activity. And then they would we would pay them. They would transfer. That's what they wanted. If it was money, if it was not, if it was ideological. But often, most of the time, there was money being paid. And then once they, believing they were transferring information to a hostile power, it's actually us who's collecting it. And then at the end of the day, the handcuffs come on, and they'd, usually lengthy prison terms.
Well, so what is the Chinese Communist Party's ultimate goal with these influence operations in the United States?
Well, again, now you're calling, for speculation as to I think that when there's an attempt to influence an outcome of an election, whether through finances, financial contributions, or whatever, presumably it's being done for a reason. I mean, large quantities of money are not going to be spent unless there's some gain, some advantage that is expected to be obtained as a result of that. So, yeah, I would suggest, I mean, again, it's speculation and opinion, but that they're seeking to obtain advantages and leverage in order to expand whatever goals that their Central Committee has established, be it economic or otherwise.
Thanks again for joining me today.
No,
it's a pleasure having you on.
My pleasure.